Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Patricia West Smith, representing the League of Women Voters of North and Central San Mateo County. We want to thank the Foster City Library and librarian Min-Yi Chu for inviting us to participate in this special program celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to our Constitution, giving women the right to vote. We are delighted to have Dr. Carol DuBois as our guest speaker. She's a distinguished research professor in UCLA's Department of History. Her research has focused on the political history of women, the history of women's suffrage in the US, and the history of American feminism. In her talk today, she will take us through the very heart of American history with vivid portraits of the suffrage movement's bold leaders and devoted activists. Dr. DuBois's recent publications are Suffrage, Women's Long Battle for the Vote, and the introduction to author Elizabeth Cady Stanton's book, 80 Years and More, Reminiscences, 1815 through 1897. Dr. DuBois's topic today is the surprising road to women's suffrage. And with that, let's give a virtual welcome to Dr. DuBois.
All right, hello everyone. Down here in Southern California, all of our thoughts and hopes are with you in this, in the fact that you're facing yet another horrible challenge. I hope you can forget the present a little as I go through a very exciting part of our past. I'm going to try and go through a very long history, 75 years, 1/4 of American history, by highlighting what I called 4 surprises in the history of women's suffrage. So, hoping that you can see my PowerPoint here. The first surprise I call the Women's Suffrage Amendment that never was. I show you this image because it was an amendment that didn't just call for women's right to vote, but for universal suffrage, an approach and an amendment, a universal suffrage for all citizens of the United States.
Dr. DuBois, your PowerPoint is not showing.
Yes, right here. This is where we are. Can you see me now?
Yes.
This woman with her hand up?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. This story begins on Election Day, November 5th, 1872. This is a day that's gotten back in the present because this is the day that that Susan B. Anthony did something that led the President of the United States to pardon her. I hope I can explain to you why this was a mistaken thing to do and why Anthony would have turned over in her grave with this pardon. Okay, on Election Day, November 5th, 1872, presidential election, hundreds of women around the country went to their local polling places and declared that they were voters. This included not just New York, that's what this image is, but all the way to Santa Cruz in the Santa Clara Valley in California. One of these women was Susan B. Anthony, the most famous suffrage activist of the day. Now, as you can see from this image, this is not a very flattering image. She looks harsh. She's sort of dressed as a female Uncle Sam, but she's also looking very determined. Anthony and her friends and relatives, women friends and relatives, went to their polling place on Election Day, and they had been able to register, much to their surprise, and they were allowed to submit their ballots. Now, how did Anthony convince the polling officer to allow her to vote? The case she made, and all of these voting women, these hundreds of voting women, made the same case. They said that the 14th Amendment, which had been ratified 5 years before in 1867, defined, yes, here's the text, The first part of the 14th Amendment did something that had never been done before. It defined national citizenship. This was not defined in the Constitution previously. And this first sentence is maybe the most litigated part of the Constitution now. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States, the state wherein they reside. So Anthony said, I'm a person, therefore I'm a citizen, a national citizen. And then it goes on to the rest of this first part of the amendment, which we're used to hearing, which is that all citizens have privileges and immunities and equal protection of the laws to life, liberty, and property, which the federal government is obligated to protect them in. And then Anthony said, and these other women said, obviously the right to vote is one of the great privileges and immunities of citizenship. Otherwise, what does citizenship mean? The polling officer let her vote, but 2 weeks later, a man knocked on her door. He was a federal marshal, and he told her she'd been arrested for illegal voting. It was a federal crime. It was a law that had been established to keep former Confederates from voting. It was not meant to be applied to a proper middle-aged woman like Susan B. Anthony. She was placed in front of a jury several months later. The case was run by a member of the Supreme Court of the United States, and the newest member named Ward Hunt. I think he might be third from the right, but I couldn't swear to it. And after her lawyers made the case, Justice Hunt said, there is no, there are only two issues. Is this person a woman, and did she vote? And since there was no contest to either of those, he declared that she was guilty, and that he dismissed the jury and found her guilty himself. He also kept her from, he didn't fine her or jail her, which she wanted to be, and therefore kept her from appealing her case. But in 1874, another woman who had tried to vote, a woman named Virginia Minor, who was from St. Louis, Virginia Minor and her husband took her case, and this came before the Supreme Court. In 1875, the court ruled on Virginia Minor's case. This case, Minor versus Happersett, is only the second women's rights case ever to come before the Supreme Court of the United States. The court ruled that yes, she was a person, and yes, she was a national citizen, but no, the right of suffrage was not one of the privileges or immunities of citizenship. It was, in fact, a privilege, and a privilege controlled by the states. And so it remains, I must tell you. It is controlled by the states, and it is a privilege that the state bestows on who it thinks deserves it. So, for instance, not felons, not former felons in Florida. Not to be deterred, the suffragists, and here, this portrait on the left is a drawing of Anthony's partner. There's Anthony, she's to her left, sitting down, but the woman standing is Elizabeth Stanton. And they presented language for a constitutional amendment that carried the same principles that had taken Anthony to her polling places. This is what I call the woman suffrage amendment that never was. The first sentence declares that the right to vote is, in fact, a right of national citizenship under the control of Congress and equally available to all citizens. It really, in some ways, repeats the language of the 14th Amendment. And then it's just in the final phrase that it addresses the question of enfranchisement or disfranchisement of sex. But this is 1878. Congress, and I must say the American people, have already passed 3 constitutional amendments. They're exhausted. They want to forget about Reconstruction and the Civil War. And the amendment that never was, never was. 40 years, instead, the women's suffrage movement within 2 years shifts to a different wording. This is the wording that continued all the way up to the 19th Amendment. It takes the wording of the 15th Amendment, the right of all citizens to vote shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or by any state on account of, and then it replaces race, color, or previous condition of servitude with the word sex. And then the second sentence is a sentence permitting laws to enforce this amendment. So let me sort of point out the difference between these 2 amendments, the amendment that never was and the amendment that was. The amendment that never was poses suffrage in the affirmative. It is a right, and it links suffrage to national citizenship. So it makes it a right at the national level. The amendment that was eventually, after another 40 years, poses the right to vote in the negative. The right shall not be denied. And it leaves it under the control of the states, which is how the original Constitution laid out voting rights. So the 19th Amendment is, one must say, first of all, it's weaker, and second of all, it only addresses women's suffrage. It doesn't address the full voting rights of American citizens. There is, and so should we don't have universal suffrage. We do not have universal suffrage. We have amendments that bar discrimination by race, which was ignored for decades, by sex, and now by age. Okay. Now, the shift to the language that became the 19th Amendment has other implications. It has racial implications. By leaving behind what I call the universal suffrage approach, the women's suffrage movement became a much less diverse, much more white-dominated movement. And this is the way it remained for the next half century. The context for this change that takes place inside the movement is that the entire country is descending into a racial reaction, which we call the Jim Crow era, that is both, uses both legal and extra-legal violence to try and force former slaves back into something looking a lot like enslavement. For their part, the leaders of the suffrage movement, who are the leaders, are white women, and they adapt to this new context. They're not particularly welcoming they're not welcoming to Black women in their national organizations. This cartoon from about 1910 is from the NAACP magazine called The Crisis. And so it's actually a criticism. You see here, this white woman is, as the slogan says, acting just like the men, votes not for women, but for white women. This is a crucial point, and we'll come back to it a lot. I should say here, before I leave the first surprise, that even in these years where the mainstream suffrage movement becomes increasingly closed to Black women, there are always Black suffragists. And we here have pictures of the woman on the right, Marianne Shadd Carey, is active in the 1870s, and the woman in the middle is active in the 1890s, and the woman on the right is active all the way through the Civil War and Reconstruction period. So we will come back to this. I think I need to say to you all, I should have said at the beginning, I am really looking forward to questions, but you should put them in the Q&A, and then we'll get a chance to talk about these. Okay, taking a breath, we now go to the second surprise, and we are moving forward in time to the last quarter of the 19th century, sometimes called the Jim Crow years, sometimes called the Gilded Age. This is the period in which, to quote Elizabeth Stanton, the constitutional door has slammed shut. There are no constitutional amendments, no federal constitutional amendments between the 15th in 1870 or 71 and the 16th, which is in the 20th century. With no opportunity to do this, the suffrage movement shifts to what we would call building its base. So now the goal is to make the demand for suffrage something that makes sense to the average woman, not just to the radicals like Stanton and Anthony and the other women who had come out of the abolitionist and Reconstruction years. I show you this picture from a magazine, very stereotypical. In the late 19th century, the female face of America, not the female population, but the face, was small town, white, Protestant, church-going, wife and mother. This woman was allegedly pious, domestic, and maternal, focused primarily on the welfare of her family and perhaps just outside the door on her nearby community. This woman had no property ownership. All property was owned by her husband. He paid all the taxes. He was the one who cared for political issues that rocked presidential elections. So abstract claims like no taxation without representation or universal justice were not particularly meaningful to these women. How might they become convinced with the power of women's suffrage? Women's suffrage is first connected to the daily lives of large numbers of conventional women, not by people like Susan B. Anthony, but by an organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Maybe some of your grandmothers and great-grandmothers belonged to this. It appears in American history mostly as the object of ridicule. It is an organization, so we are told, by axe-wielding harridans like this really foreboding woman who comes into a bar, into a saloon, to try to keep men from having an occasional beer to get away from the old ball and chain at home. Attacking men and all their mild vices. In 1884, really, this is very early, about a decade after the failure of Minor versus Happersett, this seemingly conventional organization becomes the first large organization outside of the small radical suffrage societies to endorse votes for women. So who is responsible for this? Oh, this is a picture of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which I used to show you that, to illustrate the fact that it was the largest women's organization in these years. Now, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was originally organized to stop alcohol abuse, and particularly the alcohol abuse by men. That men were the drinkers. They drank up their families' wages, and they were, as this image shows, allegedly violent to their wives and their children. The wife, where's the rest of your wages? How am I going to pay the landlord and buy food for the children? Shut up. What I do with my money is the business, no business of yours. As I said, 1884, the WCTU begins to organize itself on behalf of suffrage. And the person who's responsible for this is the president of the organization, who in 1890 and 95 was no doubt the most famous woman in the United States, although most of us do not know her name. Her name was Frances Willard. This is a picture of her on the left. She was an educator. She was a religious woman. She was a Methodist. Her parents were abolitionists. I love the image on the right. This is from a little book she wrote called How I Learned to Ride the Bicycle. The bicycle was really important to women in these years. It gave them freedom of movement. And here is this very proper little old lady. She's probably 50 years old, but she is determined to learn how to ride the bike. And whereas when we learned to ride bicycles, it was our fathers who held the back of the bike. Here are her two younger supporters who are holding on to the bicycle before she learns how to ride the bicycle. Now, the brilliance of Willard was that she really basically rebranded women's suffrage. The term women's suffrage was already associated with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton. And in order to get conventional women, it really needed to be rebranded. I liken this to rebranding abortion rights to choice, sort of making it seem less frightening. And the term that she developed, Frances Willard developed for suffrage, was what she called the home protection ballot. The argument here is that women needed the right to vote to protect their homes. They needed to step out of women's sphere in order to protect women's sphere. And this argument brilliantly vaulted these conventional late 19th century women over the walls that separated women's private lives from men's public lives. Willard dies pretty young, but the argument is carried into the 20th century and adapted to a new generation of women, women who are a little more urban, less rural, and less small town. They're not just Protestant. Many of them are now young, immigrants who are Catholic and Jewish. Many of them are, they're led by labor and urban reformers. And they are using basically the same argument, which is women need the right to vote to do things that are important to her, that she will bring into politics, that men will not bring into politics. And you see here the same sort of argument. Instead of home protection, she is cleaning up the dirty pool of politics, the muck at the bottom of the picture with her ballot. And these issues include food adulteration and white slavery, which is the word for trafficking in women. I'll show you these two pictures because they illustrate the kinds of issues which early 20th century suffragists, using the argument that women needed to vote to address certain issues that were important to women, how this is adapted to the 20th century. Both of these are very, very iconic images done by important photojournalists. The picture on the left, the unbelievable picture, comes from the streets of New York, and it shows children playing next to a dead horse. So this picture captures a set of goals about urban reform, creating playgrounds and places for children to play, making the city safe for children. The one on the left shows us, we can either call them young women or we can call them children, girls, who are working in factories. And so this is another set of goals that are important to women, improving labor conditions, especially for women workers. Okay, so now we're moving to suffrage surprise number 3. We're at the turn of the century. As we said, the constitutional door is closed, is still closed, and yet women are interested in using their rights, using the vote for issues that are important to them. How could that be? And here, the surprise, which I think is in fact one of the most important, is that many women had full voting rights before the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. They gained these rights by amendment to their state constitutions. And when they got voting rights, because the state of Colorado or California or Washington changed its constitution, the rights they got to vote were not just for their state legislature, but gave them rights to vote for their congresspeople and all the way up to president. This picture here is a picture of women in Wyoming who got the right to vote got some rights to vote when they were still a territory, but territorial citizens could not vote for president. When Wyoming came into the Union in 1890, it came in with voting rights for women. The first state in which suffragists go to the voters to get them, to the male voters, to change their constitution is the state of Colorado in 1893, 7 times as large as Wyoming. This is a picture of one of the leaders of the California suffrage movement. Her name was Elizabeth Ensley. She's a leader of the Denver Black community. She had been a member of the Howard faculty, and she was treasurer of the Colorado women's suffrage movement. And I use this, and I'll come back to this. It's the point I raised earlier. All the way through, there are Black women, even when white leaders of the suffrage movement are hostile to them. Black women find ways to support the right to vote. By the time the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, the women of Colorado had voted for United States president in 6 elections. And here's a wonderful picture of the Colorado women voting. I just adore this picture. Do these women look hesitant or uncomfortable with their rights to vote? No, they do not. They are very proud voters, and they're walking along with men into their local polling places. The 6th of these, what were called free or suffrage states, was our very own California, which in 1911 amended the state constitution to give women, again, I repeat, full voting rights. California was very important. This campaign in 1911 was the first truly modern suffrage campaign. And we can already see in many ways it's beginning to look modern. And let us say, starting with the fact that they're automobiles. The coalition that gathered together to win the right to vote for suffragists, for women, was a different coalition. It included college women, and there were now substantial numbers of women, particularly who had graduated from the University of California, places like Stanford and Santa Clara University, and wage-earning women. And women were now already a quarter of the industrial labor force. I had an article about the Los Angeles role in this movement, and I was happy to show that Los Angeles carried the state to victory. So sorry, San Francisco. The California movement was also racially diverse. There were not a tremendous number of Black women in the state, but they were involved. But the really important groups of women were some Asian women. They were still, Asian immigrants were still barred from being naturalized. And there were other laws that were keeping down the birth of Asian American citizens. But there was a great deal of attention paid to the voting of the small number of Asian women born in California already. And then finally, a much larger group, maybe, I don't know, 25, 30% of, certainly of Los Angeles. And these were Spanish-speaking women. We can call them Hispanic. Not Chicano. This woman, Maria de Lopez, who I discovered in my research, her family set up in California before statehood. She was highly educated. She was probably the first Spanish-speaking woman to be employed by the southern part of the University of California, later UCLA. And then it's a modern movement because it uses all kinds of modern devices. As I already pointed out, there's a lot of use of automobiles, of telephones. I'm showing you here a movie, actually, that I've discovered the first suffrage movie appeared 2 years after in 1913. But the California suffragists figured out ways to do kind of a suffrage slideshow, and they convinced local Nickelodeons, local movie theaters to show this slideshow and promised that this would bring people in to their establishment. Here's another image from California that really captures the fact that this was a modern movement. This woman on the left, she has a bob, she has a short haircut. This very beautiful image, which actually was the winning image in a campaign, sets a woman in a kind of native, almost, dress, very Art Nouveau, Art Deco, and posed in front of, that's the Golden Gate. There's no bridge there yet. And she's surrounded by the setting sun, which also gives her a kind of halo. So let me move forward. However, going to gain women the right to vote state by state could never enfranchise all of the women of the United States. And this was particularly true in the former Confederate states, the Jim Crow South, where the specter of opening the door of the franchise to Black women was a terror. These were white supremacist states who had just succeeded in driving Black men out of the franchise by methods legal and violent. This determination to keep women out, Black women out of the right to vote. Let me hold this off for a minute. So this image of Black women being, of Black women holding the franchise is the opposite of the other. This is an image that comes from anti-suffrage and anti-Black propaganda. And so we see these Black women who, you know, look at their shoes, look at their outfits. They barely look like women. And of course they are portrayed with highly stereotypical images of Black people, these giant lips. So here is what here's what women's suffrage will bring. Well, Missy, here we is, votes for colored ladies. So this is meant to terrify Southern states from giving women the vote, because that will allow Black women in the right to vote. Before I leave, I want to say that, again, I want to point out the presence of, the increasing presence of Black women in reform organizations and in the suffrage movement. These are women, so here we're now in about 1900 or so. These are women who are just a generation out of slavery, but they have become educated, many have become educated, they've formed their own suffrage societies because they're not admitted into white societies, and they have their own national leaders. And the woman on the left, this is a picture of her as a young woman, Ida B. Wells, who comes into prominence. She's a journalist. She's driven out of her home in Memphis. She moves to Chicago, and she begins to engage in a national and, in fact, international campaign against epidemic lynching of Black people, mostly men, but also women. Okay. So now we get to the fourth a little lost, hold on. Oh, before we get there. Nonetheless, it is the case that by the middle of the 1910s, women in all of these white-colored states west of the Mississippi now have full voting rights. And so something like 14% of the women of the nation, maybe 4 million, are part of the electorate. And so leaders of the national suffrage movement begin to realize that these women have the tools that can be used to open the constitutional door for all women with a federal amendment. And so they begin campaigns to get these voting women of the West to use their votes on behalf of a federal amendment. And they particularly mobilize in the election of 1916. This is the election in which Wilson is running for his second administration. They go to these women of the West and they say, use your votes because Wilson kept us out of women's suffrage. He opposed women's suffrage. He was a Democrat, he was a Southern Democrat, and he followed Southern Democratic beliefs. However, something else occurs in 1916, which is the United States, the war is threatening. And Wilson says he's going to keep the United States out of the World War. And this brings him back into his second administration. He doesn't keep America out of the war. And a month after he's inaugurated, the United States joins the Great War. After the election, and Wilson is elected, suffragists shift their tactics and begin to use protests, civil disobedience, nonviolent protests. They become the first group of reformers, protesters, who picket the White House, which they do all the way through 1917. And they are challenging Wilson. He says he's a prophet of democracy, but he opposes democracy in his own country. Once the United States goes to war in April, these protesters are thrown into jail. What they're doing is treasonous, and some of them are subjected to force feeding and other forms of, they consider themselves political prisoners, but they are force fed and they are held in jail. The bravery of these women begins to shift the political environment. Now we're in late 1917. But the real change comes when yet one more state changes its constitution to grant women the right to vote. And this is the first, not only the first state east of the Mississippi, but the most populous and most powerful state with the largest congressional delegation in the country, and this is New York. New York, there's a campaign. This occurs not only during the war, but well, I think I'll show this image a little later. Not only during the war, and so these women have to be careful not to appear to be unpatriotic, but the flu is beginning to settle on the country, and I think I have images to talk about this. All right, so now we're at the fourth and final surprise, which is that the women's suffrage movement, the women's suffrage amendment that we know almost wasn't. And congressional passage and ratification nearly failed. What's my timing like? I'm going to take 5 more minutes and get to the end here. The amendment that became the 19th Amendment was submitted to, was placed before the House of Representatives in January of 1918. And if you look closely, you'll see that the congressperson who's doing this is a woman. This is a woman named Jeanette Rankin, who was elected from the state of Montana, where women had the right to vote. The House passes, you need, getting an amendment is really hard. You need 2/3 of each House and 3/4 of the states. It passes the House of Representatives without a vote to spare, but it takes over a year for the Senate to pass the bill which authorizes an amendment. And by this time, we are really in the thick of the flu epidemic, which when I wrote my book, I didn't pay any attention to the flu epidemic, but oops, I noticed it. Women how do women push for the right to vote even during a flu epidemic? Well, first of all, they have a lot of appreciation by the nation. So many doctors are overseas with the Army that it's women, nurses, who are really doing the work of a medical treatment. And then the other fact is that these suffragists are now decades into this work, and they are disciplined, and they have the determination to proceed. I'm going to go forward. In June of 1919, a year and a half after the House passed the amendment, and after the Senate turns over and Republicans are in control, it passes the amendment, and now it's out to ratification. Now, I'll do this very quickly. Ratification is the toughest road, 3/4 of the states. We know this because the ERA, of course, failed of ratification. The first 30, then 35 states turn over rather quickly, but then it becomes more and more difficult to get the last, the 36th state. And we see here the states that were left, the former Confederacy, and 2 rock-ribbed conservative Republican states in the Northeast, New Hampshire and Connecticut. In the end, and many of you may already know this story, the state that finally, the legislature that finally voted to ratify the amendment was the border state of Tennessee, where unlike most southern states, here's this Tennessee legislature in the boiling hot summer of 1920, sort of like now, boiling hot. Tennessee had a Republican Party as well as a Democratic Party. So there was a little bit of competition. Here's the story that many of you know. The final vote for in the Tennessee legislature was cast by this good-looking fellow, a 24-year-old Republican from East Tennessee named Harry Byrne. And the legend, which turns out to be true, is that his mother sent him a letter telling him to be a good boy and vote for suffrage. And he did, but he didn't only do it for his mother. He was subject to a lot of pressure, but he kept his vote, and he became the final vote. Now, last week, or earlier this week, we were told that the day that Tennessee voted for suffrage, which was the 18th of August, was the day that the amendment was ratified. It's not true. There were many dirty tricks to try to undo what Tennessee had done. And it was really only when the ratification was brought to the desk of the United States Secretary of State, a man named Colby, who signed it early in the morning of August 26th, that it officially became an amendment to the Constitution and could not be undone. So that is where we are. I am going to undo my screen sharing, and I think there we are. I apologize for a few glitches, but same as the Democratic Convention, a few glitches here and there. Okay, I think that Nicole is going to be reading questions, which I hope you all, I know you have them, so I hope you've put them in the question and answer. Did they, Nicole?
Yes, we have some questions. Thank you for that talk. It was fantastic. I have questions of my own, but I will hold those for the end. I'm just going to jump in. Was there any pushback from the federal government towards states that gave women the right to vote? And that's a question from Daniela.
I'm not sure of the understanding. I'm going to take it in one direction, which is when I tried to understand and come to a conclusion about what was the major obstacle in these 75 years. And even though there was plenty of sexism in society, I concluded that the major obstacle was the leaders of the political parties. And interestingly enough, in the 2 times in which, as I said, the constitutional door was open, in Reconstruction and then in the progressive years, the Liberal Party, in the first case it was the Republicans, in the second case it was the Democrats, the leaders did not want to enfranchise women. They knew that letting in half of the people of the United States, of every class, race, region, religion, they couldn't control women's votes. And established parties don't like to enfranchise people that they can't be sure will vote for them. So this was the obstacle that women had, that women's suffrage had to break down. And it was really only when the pressure of women in the streets and in their state polling places was impossible to resist that and when there was a kind of competition between the 2 parties, that women's suffrage finally happened. I would have made this point, which is, you know, it didn't have to happen in 1920. We're treating this as if it was inevitable. But, you know, France, which was a democracy before we were, didn't give women the right to vote until after the Second World War. So as horrible as it might be, it could have been that women didn't gain the right to vote in 1920. I'm not sure if that's the question that was asked. Not sure what it means. Did the federal government push back?
Okay, thanks. Were there non-Christian suffragist organizations around the same time as the Temperance Union?
Well, as I indicated, into the late 19th century, immigration begins to ramp up in the late 80s and the 90s. And this immigration is, these groups of immigrants are very Catholic and very Jewish. But they are not really organized and do not begin to move into the political realm and to be available to the suffrage movement to draw into it until a little bit later in the progressive era in the 1910s. There are an occasional I pay most attention to Jewish women. There is a very occasional Jewish woman in the suffrage movement from the very beginning, but only very few numbers. There's a woman I like a lot whose name is Ernestine Rose, who comes to this country in 1836 and is an important mentor to Elizabeth Stanton. But it's an overwhelmingly, this includes African Americans who of course are overwhelmingly or entirely Protestant.
Thank you. 2 questions, I think I'm going to combine them. Lynn asks, where might I find more info on Maria de Lopez? I'd like to share role model to Hispanic kids in my elementary library. And then Sarah asks, what would you suggest for further reading on the suffrage movement based on what you've come across in your research? And I think that a lot of us are interested in the role of women of color in the movement. So is there additional reading?
Well, I have a little bit of information on Maria de Lopez here. I have tried to get some more attention to her. I think you can look her up. She's in Wikipedia. She's been put there. There are 2 new books that are coming out very soon on women of color. Next month, there's a book called Vanguard by Martha Jones, which is on African American women. And then there is a book, I don't know the title, but the author's name is Catherine Cahill, Cahill. And this looks at women of color more broadly. And I think she particularly pays attention to the Southwest. And so she has information on Hispanic and Native women. Let me point out something about Native women in particular. Tribal Native women, tribal Native people, men as well as women, do not have the right to vote until a federal law is passed in 1923. That is to say, after the 19th Amendment. So we're getting a little bit of attention to Native women who have become figures in the leadership of their community, and educated women who are writing about women's rights. But there can't be voting rights for Native women until this barrier to voting rights for all Native people is removed.
Can you talk more about the protest methods the women suffragettes used? Are there things we can learn from them today? That's from Danielle. And then Daniela asks, any data on how police treated white versus suffragists of color?
All right, let me do the second half. People. This is 1910. It's Jim Crow. Washington, D.C. is a southern state, and the nation is being ruled by southern white supremacist Democrats. Black women are not in, or rarely in, national protests in this period. There is an occasional person, among the more famous, Ida B. Wells, presses her way into the DC March of 1913. Mary Church Terrell is the one Black woman we know that protests in front of the White House. So they're really not, the attacks on Black women come after 1920, come from the southern states in which the majority of them live, and the white supremacist governments that use everything they can, not to my knowledge violence, but all of their legal maneuvers to keep Black women from voting and to force them into the same disfranchisement that Black men have been forced. But these are state governments, not federal government. Federal government sort of doesn't have to do that. Now, after women get the right to vote, Black women, along with the NAACP, organize a campaign to, do you remember there was the last sentence in the Women's Suffrage Amendment that gives the government the right to enforce this with legislation? They go to Congress and they ask for legislation, federal legislation, to protect women of color, to protect women, a particular category of them, in their newly found right to vote against state action. And the 19th Amendment says that could happen, but Congress won't do it. It's actually now a Republican Congress, but they are just uninterested. This is not the party of Lincoln anymore. They are not interested in Black women's votes. Black women are important in states and cities like New York City and Chicago, where Black voters are an important part of the Republican Party. And there they organize and begin to pull together in ways that continue in the 20s and 30s and 40s. Now, the first part of the question is about the tactics that these women use. There are two categories. One is they're women who are working on the outside, civil disobedience, and they, as I said, protest in front of the White House. They stand in silence, holding their signs. We do these things now in our own demonstrations. We use signs. Most of us are nonviolent, and that we're following in their footsteps. Some of them, they are arrested, and I guess we might take something from their playbook. They announce that they are political prisoners, and they engage in they get going a movement to protest their arrest and to demand that they be treated like political prisoners. Eventually, they win, and the city of Washington, D.C., which is the one that's arrested them, is forced to let them go. The other set of suffragists engage in inside tactics, and they lobby. And they are brilliant, brilliant lobbyists. And lobbying is already not a nice thing to do, but they call themselves the front door lobby. They say they have rules which we could abide by. Always knock on the door, because you don't know what the congressman might be doing behind it. As soon as you've finished talking to the congressman, and even if he won't give you he won't help you, never get angry or frustrated. Say thank you and leave, and so that the next person can go in after you and continue the work. Be nice to the secretary, because that's how you're going to get in. And when you're done, go into the ladies' room and write down all your notes. These are rules which we might well hold by. And they are so determined. They do this for 3 or 4 years until they win.
So we are
one or two more.
Yeah, getting close to the end. Let's see. We have 3 minutes. Last question. Are there parallels between voting, the struggle for voting rights then and the struggle for voting rights today? I think maybe that's one that we can end on. 30 seconds, because we're
30 seconds. Yes, it's a great question. On the one hand, those 75 years are a kind of voter suppression, no question. On the other hand, the 75 years in which women can't vote. On the other hand, in the next 50 years, women have to face lots of obstacles, and women running for office particularly have to face the kind of sexism that women running for office continue to face today. Yes, there is a link between the suffrage movement. We must not treat the 19th Amendment, when it's ratified in 1920, as the end of the battle. We've already seen that Black women have to fight for another 45 years to get the right to vote. And women in general take several decades before they come together in what we now call the gender gap. And women vote now more than men, and they are more liberal and more democratic than men. But that took a long time. It took almost as long as getting the vote. Yeah.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. I'm going to pass it on to Patricia West from the League of Women Voters to close out our program.
Oh, let me say that the League of Women Voters is, in fact, one of the organizations really campaigning against voter suppression. So that's one of the links.
Super.
All right. Thank you, Dr. DuBois. Before we sign off on this session, we have 2 further notes. You can find the books Suffrage and 80 Years at smcl.org in digital and print formats, or you may purchase either title by clicking on the link in chat. Proceeds go to support the Library Foundation and Florey's Bookstore in Pacifica. And finally, if you've been inspired to carry on the efforts of the suffragists, the League of Women Voters of North and Central San Mateo County welcomes new members. You can reach us at lwvnscsmc.org/join. Thank you for participating in this informative event.
And thank you all, and keep your windows closed.
We will. Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for participating. That concludes our program today. We there's been information in the chat about an additional book share. We're going to talk about what we're reading about women and the vote on August 26th on Women's Equality Day. Thank you again, everyone.